The gun was already on the table when Lydia walked in with her mop bucket. She hadn't meant to be there. The service elevator on the 14th floor of the Hardcastle building had been out since Tuesday, which meant the evening cleaning crew had to use the main Forsyth. Cart, bucket, and all had rounded the corner to the executive wing at exactly the wrong moment, and now she was standing in the doorway of Conference Room C with nowhere to go. 7 men looked up. One of them had a gun, not pointed at her, not yet. It was sitting beside a crystal whiskey glass on the mahogany table, casual as a paperweight, the way powerful men leave weapons in plain sight to remind everyone in the room exactly where the power lives. The man it belonged to had silver hair and the kind of stillness that doesn't come from calm. It comes from having made decisions that other men couldn't live with. His name was Edward Verne. She didn't know that yet. Lydia said, "Sorry, wrong floor," even though it was absolutely not the wrong floor, because sometimes the only thing your brain produces under pressure is a polite lie. Nobody moved. The man at the head of the table, younger, dark-suited, a jaw like it had been carved out of something that didn't apologize, held up one hand without looking at her. Just a hand, flat in the air. Stay. She stayed. The bucket wheel squeaked once and went quiet. 3 hours earlier, Lydia had been eating leftover pasta in the break room on the 9th floor, listening to her co-worker Bet complain about the new supervisor's scheduling changes. Lydia did this most nights. Ate quietly, nodded in the right places, went back to work. She was good at being in the background. She'd had a lot of practice. She was 31 years old. She had a degree in international economics from McGill that she never told anyone about, because nobody asked the cleaning staff about their education, and she'd learned early that volunteering that information created a specific kind of awkwardness that didn't benefit anyone. She had student loans that would outlive several houseplants. She had a studio apartment in Little Portugal and a cat named Biscuit and a half-finished translation of a 19th-century French legal Sundays because she found it genuinely interesting, which she also never told anyone about. She was, by most measures, invisible. The Hardcastle building housed 3 floors of a private equity firm called Meridian North. Lydia cleaned their offices 4 nights a week. She knew which executives left their takeout containers directly beside the bin instead of in it. She knew which assistant kept a bottle of Malbec in the bottom drawer of her filing cabinet. She knew that the man in the corner office with the view of Lake Ontario kept a framed photo of a woman on his desk that did not appear to be his wife, based on the wife's photo on the company website, which Lydia had never intentionally looked at but had simply absorbed, the way you absorb things when you spend enough time in a place that belongs to someone else. That man, the one in the corner office, was Callum Forsyth. Different Forsyth. No relation, as far as she knew. She'd noticed the name the first week and thought, well, that's something, and then gotten on with vacuuming. His full name, according to the nameplate she dusted every Tuesday, was Callum Wren Forsyth. He ran Meridian North. He had, by all available evidence, never once noticed that the woman who cleaned his office shared his last name, which was fine. That was fine. Back in Conference Room C, Lydia had pressed herself against the wall beside a credenza and was doing something she was extremely good at, being absolutely still and making no sound whatsoever. The meeting continued. It had, she gathered, been going on for some time before she arrived. There were papers on the table, half-empty glasses, the residue of a meal that had been cleared away. The men were arranged in a specific geometry, 3 on one side, 3 on the other, and the silver-haired man, Edward Verne, at the far end, flanked by 2 others who had not spoken yet, and who had the specific quality of men whose job is to make sure other men don't have to repeat themselves. Callum Forsyth sat at the near end of the table. This was the first time Lydia had seen him this close. He was, in person, exactly what the nameplate suggested, contained, precise, a man who did not waste motion. He was probably 40, maybe 42. There was a quality to his focus that she recognized from people who had spent years in rooms where being wrong had consequences, a kind of permanent alertness underneath the stillness. Across from him, one of Vern's associates, a compact man with a Brussels accent she'd already clocked, was speaking in rapid French. Callum's translator, a young man with a leather portfolio and an expression of barely managed panic, leaned in and murmured something. Vern raised his eyebrows. In French to his associate, he said, "He didn't understand a word of that, did he?" The associate said in French, "Probably not." The translator got the gist but missed the conditionality. "He thinks we agreed to the northern transfer, we didn't." Vern, still in French, "Good. Let him think that until the papers are signed." Lydia's pencil, which she'd been gripping in her jacket pocket since she walked in, snapped in half. Nobody heard it but her. She stood very still and thought, with remarkable clarity for someone currently standing in a room containing a firearm and a conspiracy. This is a significant problem. She had learned French the way she'd learned most things, sideways, because it was adjacent to something else she wanted. She'd picked up Dutch at 19 because she'd wanted to read a particular historian's untranslated work. She'd taught herself enough Mandarin to follow a lecture series she couldn't afford to attend in person. Spanish because her grandmother's neighbor had needed someone to read her letters, and Lydia had shown up one afternoon with a dictionary and come back every week for 2 years Italian because she'd once spent 4 months into depressive spell, during which the only thing that helped was learning the declensions. 7 languages, if you counted Latin, which most people didn't, and most people were probably right. She had never, in her life, deployed any of this in a way that made a single dollar's difference to her situation. She was beginning to think that might be about to change. The meeting shifted. Vern's associate switched to Dutch. Lydia suspected deliberately a test, and said something about the northern accounts that was technically about port schedules, but was actually about moving money through a series of holding companies in a way that would be, to put it gently, extremely illegal, under 3 separate international frameworks she could name from memory. The translator looked at his portfolio. He wrote something down. He looked up and said, quietly to Callum, "He's talking about shipping logistics." Standard coordination for the transfer. Callum nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're not sure, but they're choosing to trust someone whose job it is to know. Vern's man said, still in Dutch, to the man beside him, "He has no idea. This is almost embarrassing." Lydia's jaw tightened. She had, at this point, roughly 3 options. She could stay against the wall and pretend she hadn't understood a word, go home and spend the rest of her life knowing she'd watched a man get walked into a financial trap that would likely end his company, possibly his freedom, and definitely his understanding of what had happened in this room tonight. She could try to leave, which would draw attention she absolutely did not want. Or she could do the thing that every sensible instinct in her body was telling her not to do. She thought about Callum's corner office, the framed photo, the nameplate she dusted every Tuesday without being thanked for it, which was fine, that was her job, but still. She thought, someone should say something. And then because she was Lydia Forsyth, and she had never in her life been able to stop herself from doing the inconvenient thing, when the inconvenient thing was clearly the right thing, she said, in French, clearly and without trembling. "Mr. Forsyth, your translator missed the conditionality." The room went very quiet. Callum turned to look at her for what seemed like the first time, though she'd been standing there for 20 minutes. His expression was not what she expected. She'd expected dismissal. What she got was something more like a man who has just realized the floor of the room is different from what he thought it was. "Pardon me," he said. "The conditional clause in the last exchange," she said, switching to English. "Your translator heard the northern transfer will proceed, but what was actually said, in French, was the northern transfer will proceed only if the base valuation remains uncontested. That's not the same agreement." Vern was looking at her with the particular stillness of a man recalibrating. Callum said, very carefully, "And the Dutch." "The Dutch was worse," she said. Nobody moved for a moment. The man with the gun, Vern's right side, close-cropped hair, hands on the table, had shifted his weight in a way she didn't like. Vern said, in English, for the first time since she'd entered the room, "Who is this woman?" It wasn't a question. It was a reordering of his model of the situation. Callum said, "She works in this building, Ike. Doing what?" A pause that felt like it lasted longer than it did. Callum said, "That's not relevant." Something about the way he said it, flat, final, the tone of a man who has decided something and is not interested in discussing it, made Vern's man settle back slightly. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Vern looked at Lydia for a long moment with the eyes of a man who has spent decades reading people and is currently doing so. Then he said, in French to his associate, "She understands Dutch and French. What else do you think?" Lydia said in French, "Italian and Spanish, if you'd like to try those next. My Mandarin is functional but not elegant. I wouldn't recommend Dutch as a private language in a room you haven't swept for comprehension." The associate made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Vern looked at her for another long moment. Then, slowly, he sat back. "Interesting," he said. What happened next took 2 more hours, and she would later struggle to describe it in a way that made it sound like something that had actually happened to a person and not a plot summary. Callum asked her, quietly, if she would stay. She said she had a cart in the hallway. He said with something that might have been the very beginning of a different expression. "The cart will keep." She stayed. She translated. Not everything. Vern's people grew careful, switched between languages more rapidly, tested her in ways that were occasionally almost elegant. She kept up. When the Belgian associate tried a specific register of formal Dutch that she'd only ever encountered in written legal documents, she caught about 70% of it and flagged the rest honestly, which she could tell surprised Callum more than getting it entirely right would have. At one point, Vern's man spoke in Italian about a clause in a sub-agreement, and Lydia said, in Italian, that the clause as written had a technical conflict with Canadian securities law that would surface within 18 months, and that whoever had drafted it was either incompetent or setting a trap. There was a silence. Vern looked at the clause. He looked at his man. He looked at Lydia. He said, in Italian, "How do you know that?" She said, "I read." By midnight, the shape of the agreement had changed. Not dramatically, not in ways that would be obvious from the outside, but the conditionalities were different. The valuation protections were explicit. 2 clauses that Lydia was 70% sure were fraudulent had been quietly excised in the redraft, blamed on formatting, and Vern had let them go with the equanimity of a man who has decided to play a longer game. Callum did not sign anything that night. When Vern's people left, coats, a brief exchange of handshakes, the gun gone from the table without comment. Callum stood at the window for a moment with his back to her. Outside, the lake was dark. The city went on. He said, without in this turning, "How long?" 14 months, she said. A pause. "What's your name?" He did turn then. She watched him process it, the name, saw the moment it landed, saw the almost smile that crossed his face and was gone again before it finished arriving. "Right," he said. "Different Forsyth," she said. "Obviously," he said. But the way he said it was different from what she'd expected. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You have a degree." "McGill," she said. "International economics. And then things didn't work out the way I'd planned, so." She gestured slightly at the room. "Here, how many languages?" 7, 8 if you count Latin, which most people don't. "Do you count it?" She thought about it. "Sometimes." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Not pity, not exactly, though there was something in it that recognized something. "The Northern account transfer," he said. "If you hadn't said anything, you would have signed something that wasn't what you thought it was," she said. And in about 6 months when the base valuation shifted, which it would have, because those were the terms they were actually agreeing to, you'd have had very limited recourse. "How limited?" she told him. She used specific numbers, which she should not have had access to but did. because she had spent 14 months in these offices, and she read what was left on desks, and she had a very good memory, and she had never once had any reason to do anything with any of it until tonight. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I need a coffee." "Do you want a coffee? I have a cart in the hallway," she said again. "Lydia," he said, and it was the first time he'd used her name, and something about the way he said it, not dismissive, not dramatic, just the specific weight of a person being seen, made her stop. "The cart can keep until morning. I'll have someone deal with it." She looked at him. The room was quiet. "Okay," she said, "coffee." She did not go home that night until almost 3 in the morning. They talked, not about the meeting, not immediately, but around it, and then through it, and then out the other side into other things. The French historian she'd been translating, a particular structural problem in 19th century contract law that Callum had, it turned out, opinions about. He'd studied at Osgood. His mother was from Quebec. He'd grown up bilingual and spent 20 years convinced that was enough, and had learned tonight that it wasn't, which was a specific kind of uncomfortable he was still processing. He asked about McGill. She told him briefly about the loans, the timing, the particular sequence of events that had led from a postgraduate acceptance letter to a cleaning cart. She didn't dramatize it. He didn't offer sympathy she hadn't asked for. He just listened, which was its own thing. At one point he said, "You should have been in that room on the other side of the table." "Probably," she said. "I'm not being kind," he said. "I'm being accurate." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I know the difference." He was quiet for a moment. "Then I have a position in the international desk. It's been open for 3 months because I haven't found anyone I trust." "You've known me for 4 hours," she said. "I've known you for 14 months, he said. "I just didn't know I did." She thought about Bet in the break room. She thought about the pasta. She thought about the Sunday translations and the studio apartment and the cat named Biscuit who would absolutely be fine until morning. "What does it pay?" she said. He told her. She did not react, because she was good at not reacting, but she felt the number land somewhere deep, and settle there like something that had been waiting for its place. "I'll need to think about it," she said. "Of course," he said. She thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. "Okay," she said. "Yes." He nodded, once the way he'd nodded at the translator earlier, but different. This time it was the nod of a man who has found what he was looking for, and is relieved not to have to keep said. "Name it. My name goes on the door," she said. "Full name. Not a job title I have to explain." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, still. "But done," he said. Outside, Lake Ontario held the city lights in its surface, patient and indifferent and very old. Lydia Forsyth finished her coffee, picked up her jacket from the back of a chair that had, until tonight, never held anything of hers, and thought, well, that's something. It was, by most measures, the first night of an entirely different life.